In 1989, if you wanted to hear Betty Broderick's side of the story, you had to wait for it. You waited for the Oprah episode to air. You read whatever People magazine had that week. You caught the Current Affairs segment if you happened to be home. Public opinion about her formed slowly, in pieces, through producers who had 12 minutes and a commercial break to explain something that took 20 years to become what it became. Betty was convicted of murdering her ex-husband and his new wife in November of 1989. The trial was one of the most watched for its era. The debate about what she was, victim, killer, cautionary tale, or something the legal system just didn't have language for, that debate ran for 30 years and never really concluded. If this happened now, it would be a TikTok in 48 hours. There'd be a Team Betty side and a Team Dan side, and several hundred or thousands of videos explaining exactly why the other side was wrong. Betty Broderick died on May 8th of this year. She was 78 years old. She had been incarcerated for 33 years. 3 of her children were at her bedside. The 4th was on FaceTime. She had appeared before the parole board twice, in 2010 and again in 2017. Denied both times, she would not have been eligible again until 2032, when she would have been 84 years old. She died in custody, never having changed her account of what happened or why, and the argument about her, whether she was a woman destroyed by a bad divorce or a woman who destroyed 2 people's lives, or somehow both, that argument didn't end with her. It's still going on today. This is the scareful story of Betty Broderick, a story about marriage, resentment, humiliation, revenge, and the uncomfortable fact that a lot of people understood her, even while agreeing that she committed murder. If you enjoy thoughtful true crime and real stories that don't have easy answers, you're in the right place. I'd really appreciate it if you would like, comment, and subscribe. And now, Betty Broderick's story. To understand what happened, you have to start before any of it happened. Most tellings of this story don't actually do that. They start with the divorce or the crime or the trial, because those are the dramatic parts, but the years before that are the whole story. Elizabeth Ann was born in 1947 in New York. She grew up Catholic in a household where certain things were simply understood. You made commitments, you honored them. You did not walk away from something just because it became difficult. The value system she absorbed was specific. She was bright and socially capable, the kind of person who made others comfortable, which is not a small skill, though it tends to go unrecorded. Nobody writes it down when somebody is easy to be around. She enrolled at the College of Mount St. Vincent in New York. She was the kind of student who could have done any number of things. And this is worth noting because it's easy in retrospect to read Betty's life as a series of limitations, as though she was always someone to whom things happened. But she wasn't. She was someone who made choices, and for a long time, those choices made perfect sense. She met Dan Broderick III in 1965 at a dance at the University of Notre Dame. Betty was 17 years old, there on a chaperone football weekend. Dan was 21, a senior about to graduate and head off to Cornell Medical School. By her own account, he asked her to marry him every day for 3 years. He promised me the moon, she told the Los Angeles Times years later. She eventually said yes, and they married in April of 1969. Dan Broderick is important to describe accurately because this story has a tendency to flatten him into a simple antagonist, and once that happens, the story becomes smaller than it actually is. He was not a cartoonish villain. He was charming, intelligent, and driven. He wanted to build something, and he knew exactly what it looked like. Betty worked in support of the family while Dan was in school, first at Cornell Medical and then at Harvard Law. She taught, she managed the household, she raised their 4 children. She was whatever the family needed her to be while he was doing what he was doing. And the understanding, stated or unstated, was that what they were building together. And that's a pretty big detail. The combination of medical school, law school, and then adding on building a legal career is expensive in any era. They weren't doing this on their savings. And when it was over and Dan had both degrees, they relocated to Southern California so that he could build his practice. There, life got very large very fast. The houses, the country clubs, the social obligations, the particular weight of being a prominent couple in La Jolla, which is not a city where that means nothing. Betty ran it. She managed the household. She raised the children. She maintained the social presence that a certain kind of professional career requires, whether anyone acknowledges it or not. The dinner parties, the right schools, the invisible infrastructure of a life that from the outside often looks like just one person's achievement. By the early 1980s, Dan was earning money that is hard to overstate. His specialty, medical malpractice, was, in that era, in San Diego, a genuinely lucrative practice. He had become president of the San Diego Bar Association. From the outside, it looked like exactly what they had both been working towards. What Betty was also doing, and this is a part that's harder to articulate, was building an identity almost entirely organized around the marriage itself. She was Betty Broderick, wife of Dan Broderick, mother to 4 Broderick children. Her sense of what she had built and what she deserved from having built it was real. The problem, and it wasn't a problem right then, but it was just the structure of a problem, was that the thing she had built her identity around was in the end Dan and Dan's life. It belonged to him. It was his career, his house, and their children. Somewhere in the early 1980s, something that nobody would have been able to identify as significant at the time very quietly started to shift. Dan's practice kept growing. Success at that scale changes the texture of a life in ways that are hard to predict and harder to manage. The schedules change, the priorities shift. The person who is achieving things spends more time in the world where they are achieving them. Front spends more time at home. This is not a dramatic process. This is what makes it hard to see from the inside. Betty was excellent at supporting a life organized entirely around someone else's work, and for a long time, that had felt like a partnership. At some point, though, it started feeling like something else. Betty couldn't have told you exactly when, though. In the fall of 1982, Dan hired a new legal assistant. Her name was Linda Kolkina. She was 21 years old, a former Delta Airlines flight attendant. Linda was, by accounts of the people who knew her, warm and genuinely likable. She was not a predator who walked into an office and dismantled a marriage. She was a 21-year-old who took a job. What developed from there is more complicated than the role she's usually assigned in this story. By October of 1983, Betty suspected something, but Dan denied it. And this is where the story enters a phase that is both very specific to the Brodericks and entirely recognizable to anyone who has ever been told that what they are observing isn't happening. Dan told her that she was imagining things. He told her that she was insecure. He told her, with the confidence of a man who argued for a living, that her concerns were not based in reality. Betty tried to let it go, but she couldn't let it go. The thing about being married to an attorney is that you are, in any argument, outmatched on a technical level. Dan knew how to construct a case. He knew how to make the absence of evidence feel like evidence of absence. Betty was arguing on instinct against someone who argued by training, and instinct tends to lose those exchanges even when it's right. She started paying attention to details she might have previously let pass. Dan's schedule, his explanations, the slight recalibrations in his behavior that you may only notice if you are specifically looking for them. And the looking changed her. Not dramatically and not overnight, but it started to make Betty into someone who was tracking things, cataloging things, building a case of her own in her head that she had no way to prove and no neutral party to present it to. By most accounts, the Broderick household was still functioning normally on the surface. The children were in school, the social calendar continued, Betty was still showing up to things she was supposed to show up to. What was happening underneath was a marriage running on something other than connection. Perhaps it was routine, maybe it was obligation. Betty later described this period as one of the loneliest of her life, not because Dan was absent, he was physically present much of the time, but because she had a version of what was happening that she couldn't get anyone to validate, including him. She was watching her marriage change in real time and being told repeatedly that she was wrong about what she was watching. That kind of sustained contradiction does something to a person. It doesn't excuse what it eventually produces, but it does explain it, and those are not the same thing. There's a specific incident from this period that I think really spells out what was happening here. On Dan's birthday, Betty surprised Dan at his office, only to find that a party had been held there and ended, and that he and Linda had left together. She went home, gathered his expensive custom-made suits, took them outside, doused them in gasoline, and set them on fire in the backyard, in front of her children. That's not a person managing her situation. That's a person who has given up trying to manage it. In 1984, Dan told Betty that he was moving out of their bedroom. He gave reasons, saying they were having problems and he needed space. But in the context of everything Betty had been tracking, the suspicions, the denials, the burning of suits, his moving out of the bedroom was not a neutral act. It was a confirmation of something that she had been told she was imagining. He moved out of the house entirely in February of 1985. In the weeks after, Betty began dropping the children off at Dan's house one by one, not as part of any negotiated arrangement, just leaving them there, which you can imagine she spent these years raising 4 kids and probably feeling somewhat thankless for it, like she wasn't being appreciated for all the work that she did. And so, yeah, I could see where a pissed off woman would be like, here, take one of the kids. Let's see how you do. I think maybe what Betty was missing is that Dan had an awful lot of money. And so, the kids could be there with the housekeeper. It wasn't necessarily Dan who was going to take over managing everything. He was just going to hire somebody to be the new Betty. Dan eventually gained full custody of the kids. They began the legal process of divorcing, and these should have been ordinary events. The difference was that Dan Broderick was one of the most skilled attorneys in San Diego, and Betty was not represented by anyone of equivalent ability. Betty later claimed Dan made it difficult for her to find an attorney willing to take her case, that his standing in the local legal community was in itself a form of leverage. That claim is disputed, but what isn't disputed is the outcome. The continuances started almost immediately. Each one extended the period in which the financial arrangements of the marriage remained unresolved. Dan controlled the finances. He always had. Betty had managed the house, but not the bank accounts. And during a divorce, that is a significant disadvantage. She started calling Dan, not occasionally, but constantly. She called Dan's office, his home, his answering machine. She left long messages, angry messages, and profane messages. This was not a phase that lasted a few weeks. It went on for years. Dan recorded the messages. Betty knew that he was recording them, but she left them anyway. Dan took the documentation a step further. He began subtracting money from Betty's monthly spousal support for each infraction, $100 every time she used an obscene word on the tapes, $250 every time she trespassed on his property, $500 each time she entered his home, $1,000 each time she took the children without notifying him first. He was subtracting from her support check with a schedule. Betty, who had legitimate grievances, was packaging them in a format being used against her, and she just couldn't help herself. And Dan was charging her for it, line by line. At some point in 1987, it became publicly known that Dan and Linda were together, not through any direct disclosure, but just confirmation through social appearances, shared events, the kind of accumulation that's hard to deny. Betty had believed this for years. She had said she believed it for years, but she had been told she was wrong. But she wasn't wrong. The anger that had been cycling through outbursts and phone calls and driveway incidents found a new and specific object. She stopped talking about the marriage failing, and she started talking about what had been done to her. Grief asks you to accept something. Injustice asks you to keep fighting. Betty was not going to accept anything. What happened over the next 2 years is not a smooth escalation. It moves the way actual deterioration moves, which is unevenly, with false plateaus and then drops that you don't see coming. The messages got worse. Betty's calls to Dan's answering machine during this period were, depending on the day, furious, pleading, threatening, occasionally coherent, occasionally not. She used language she would have found unthinkable 10 years earlier. She had nicknames for Dan and Linda that she used openly, including in front of the children. But Betty hadn't lost her mind, and that's the uncomfortable part. She could sit down and have a totally normal conversation. The messages were not the output of someone who had completely disconnected from reality. They were the output of someone who had found one specific channel for a specific category of feeling and was using it without restraint. Dan kept recording them. He kept every tape. By this point, the dynamic had become almost procedural. She escalated, he documented, she escalated more, he documented more. She was giving him material he would use in court for years, and she knew it, but she just kept going. I just don't think she could help herself. The children were caught in the middle in ways that are hard and sad to think about. They were teenagers, mostly during the worst of this period, old enough to understand what was happening, old enough to be pulled toward one parent's version of events or the other's. Betty loved her kids. That's never been in question. But love and stability are not the same thing. Her daughter Kim would later testify for the prosecution at trial, describing one phone call where Betty had said, "I just remembered I hate your guts. You just make me sick, and why would I want to come over and visit you?" When Kim asked why, Betty told her it was because she was a traitor. She meant a traitor to the cause of the divorce. That's the testimony of a daughter who still, by most accounts, loved her mother. It's a description of what it was like to be on the receiving end of that household dynamic. Her other daughter, Lee, saw things differently. She testified for the defense, describing the same years as a portrait of a mother systemically worn down. Not someone who had snapped, but someone who had been ground down to the point where nothing made sense anymore. Two daughters, the same childhood, two completely different accounts of what that meant. Betty's son, Rhett, would later say that he and his brother had gone to Dan directly more than once and warned him, not having your children was driving their mother towards something. She could do something extremely irrational, Rhett recalled telling his father. Dan's response to those warnings, if there was one, is not recorded. The incident most people remember, other than the murder, is what happened in November of 1987. Betty drove over to Dan's house where Dan and Linda were present and drove her Suburban through the front door. Not into the door, through it and into the entryway. Nobody was physically hurt, but when Dan tried to pull her from the vehicle, she allegedly had a butcher knife under the front seat of her car. Betty was arrested and held briefly at a mental health facility, and the charges were eventually reduced. She later maintained that she was only mentally unstable because Dan had made her that way to justify the divorce. That's the argument she would make in various forms for the rest of her life. Dan and Linda married in April of 1989. Betty's children were in the wedding party, but Betty, of course, was not invited. Betty found out through her children, not Dan and Linda, but through her children, that they were getting married. She called the answering machine. The tape is not publicly available, but the descriptions of what she said on it are, and it's pretty brutal. The wedding and the shooting are only 7 months apart. In those 7 months, nothing really changed. The messages continued, the legal proceedings continued. Rhett had warned his father, but the warnings didn't change anything. A week before the shooting, Betty wrote a letter to her divorce attorney. "I can't stand this anymore," she wrote, describing what she called the constant insinuation that she was crazy. She was describing a dead end. She was describing it coherently. The day before the shooting, she received a legal notice from Dan's attorney warning that if she continued her harassment, she would be blocked from seeing her children. Betty told law enforcement later that she read that letter as the final proof of everything she had been saying for years, that the system in the hands of someone who knew how to use it could be pointed at you like a weapon. The next morning, she drove to their house. The divorce had been finalized in January of 1989. The settlement gave Betty the house, a lump sum, and monthly support payments. The specific numbers were not what she had asked for. She contested them almost immediately. Dan and Linda married in April, and Betty bought a gun in August. She bought it legally from a sporting goods store, a 5-shot, .38 caliber revolver. She kept it in her purse for 3 months. She went about her life, drove her children to things, made phone calls, and contested the divorce settlement. Nobody around her thought the situation was any more dangerous than it had been, which is to say she was behaving the way she had been behaving for 4 years, which everyone had learned to read as manageable. She came to the house at 5:30 in the morning. She let herself in through the back door using a key she had taken from her daughter. Then she went upstairs. The house was quiet. Dan and Linda were asleep. She fired 5 shots. 2 bullets struck Linda in the head and chest. She died immediately. 1 bullet struck Dan in the chest. He did not die immediately. He was on the floor, reaching for the phone. Betty walked toward the bed, pulled the phone cord from the wall, and left it in the hallway out of reach. Then she left. Betty later said she had spoken to him, and she says that Dan said, okay, you got me. Dan Broderick was 44 years old. Linda Broderick was 28. She was 2 months pregnant. The first call Betty made was not to 911, but to her daughter Lee. What Betty said was, "I finally did it. And then I shot him." Betty told Lee to call the police. Then she hung up, drove to a friend's house, and waited. She turned herself in. The phrasing, "I finally did it," stayed with people who covered the trial. The word finally implies something that had existed as a possibility for long enough to be named. That's not a legal finding, but it's something. The news reached San Diego by mid-morning. By afternoon, it was moving faster. A Current Affair was in its prime. Hard Copy was on the air. These were programs that understood exactly what their audience wanted: a clear victim, a clear villain, and a reason to have feelings about both. Betty Broderick did not fit that format cleanly, though. That was, in part, why the story ran as long as it did. The early coverage split almost immediately. There was a version in which Betty was a woman discarded after 20 years of investment who had reached a breaking point that the system failed to prevent. And there was a version in which she was a violent, obsessive ex-wife who had terrorized her former husband for years and then murdered him and his new wife in their bed. Both versions were available in the actual facts, and that was the problem and the only reason the story didn't go away. Women called radio stations in the days after the arrest, flooding call-in programs in San Diego, calling to say that they understood Betty, calling to say that they had been through divorces that felt like the one Betty described. They didn't endorse what she had done, but they understood how somebody could get there. The media, for the most part, didn't know what to do with that distinction, so it flattened it. Betty became either a feminist symbol or a cautionary tale, and neither category had room for the actual complexity of what had happened. Dan did not deserve to be shot, and Linda certainly didn't deserve to be shot. That needs to be said, and it also needs to be said that saying it plainly doesn't close the question, though, of how we got here. It just locates where the question starts. The trial would take both positions, put them in a room together, and ask 12 people to decide which one was true, and they couldn't. The first trial began in October of 1990. Betty's defense attorney, Jack Early, opened by slamming a framed portrait of the Broderick family onto the podium and shattering it in front of the jury. The gesture was theatrical. It was also the argument in physical form. This is the family that Dan Broderick destroyed. His case was that the years of sustained psychological and financial damage had produced a mental state in which Betty could not be held fully responsible for what had happened. Betty took the stand in her own defense. She testified that when she drove to the house on the morning of November 5th, she had not intended to kill Dan. She intended to speak with him and then to kill herself. She had slash marks on her left wrist. Early had her hold out her arm for the jury to see. Prosecutors argued that the marks were more for show than evidence of a genuine suicide attempt. The prosecution's argument was simpler. Betty bought a gun and she kept it for 3 months. She drove to the house at 5:30 in the morning, removed the phone so that Dan couldn't call for help, fired 5 shots, called her daughter, turned herself in. That is not the behavior of somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. The jury deliberated for a week and came back deadlocked. 2 jurors held out for manslaughter, citing lack of intent. They could not call it murder. 12 jurors heard everything: the tapes, the years of documented escalation, the 5 shots, the removed phone, the phrase, "I finally did it," and yet they couldn't make one unanimous decision. The public reaction was immediate and loud. Betty's supporters read it as confirmation that reasonable people understood what she had been through. Her detractors read it as disturbing evidence that sympathy for an articulate, well-presented woman was capable of overriding the facts of a double homicide. Betty gave interviews after the mistrial. She was composed. She talked about the divorce, the settlement, and what she felt had been taken from her. The interview made people uncomfortable in a very specific way, not because she seemed unhinged, but because she seemed reasonable. She could articulate her grievances clearly and calmly, and following the logic made some people feel implicated in a way that they didn't want to feel implicated. That's what made her a difficult public figure. Betty wasn't a monster. She wasn't a martyr. She was a person who had done something really terrible, but could explain it with some coherence, the road that led her there. And that coherence was, for a lot of people, more disturbing than incoherence would have been. The second trial began in December of 1991. A new jury, but the same evidence. Betty was convicted on 2 counts of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of 15 years to life, the maximum, plus 2 years for illegal use of a firearm. She was 44 years old. She did not express remorse in the way the court seemed to expect. The judge told her she had just confirmed every reason for the sentence he was about to impose, and she was taken into custody. Betty gave interviews from inside prison. She corresponded with supporters. She maintained the position she had always maintained, that what happened was the product of circumstances that had been forced on her, that the legal system had failed her, and that the people now judging her had not been inside the situation she had been inside. In a letter she wrote to a San Diego news station years later, she described herself as having been gang raped by the courts. The language was extreme, the grievance behind it was unchanged. She first appeared before the parole board in January of 2010. All 4 of her children were present and spoke. 2 said she should stay in prison. Her son Daniel told the board that his mother was still hung up on justifying what she did. He also said, "In my heart, I know my mother is a good person, but along the way she got lost. Releasing a lost person in society could be a dangerous mistake." Her son Rhett had a different view. "She's a nice lady. Everyone here would like her if they spoke with her on any topic other than my dad. Keeping her in prison isn't really helping her. She's not a danger to society. The only 2 people she was a danger to are dead." 2 siblings, the same mother, the same murders, 2 completely different positions on what should happen next. The board denied parole. Their reason in both 2010 and 2017 was consistent. Betty would not express remorse in the specific form required. She would acknowledge that Dan and Linda were dead. She would describe the harm to her children, and then she would explain again the circumstances that had produced what happened. The board wanted an acknowledgement of harm that didn't route through self-justification. Betty's version always routed through self-justification, though. She couldn't seem to separate the 2, or she wouldn't. Whether those are the same thing is a question people answer differently. At the 2017 hearing, she reportedly banged her fist on the table, calling Dan an SOB, and told his friends who were present, "I'm sorry you lost your drinking buddy." Parole was, not surprisingly, denied again. She would not have been eligible again until 2032. You just gotta wonder, you know how they say people who are incarcerated for long periods of time, they get so used to being incarcerated that they almost fear the idea of being out again? I know one of Betty's daughters wanted her to come and live with her and offered that up to the parole board. And so you'd think Betty would have kind of been excited about that and would have maybe been able to get herself to say, you know, not just, oh, yes, I killed them, but I killed them and it was wrong. And even though I was hurt, I shouldn't have taken out my hurt on them, and I shouldn't have hurt my children by taking away their father or something. But man, talk about stubborn. Betty Broderick was one stubborn lady if she couldn't bring herself to say what they needed to hear in order to get out of prison. Betty died on May 8th, 2026 at 3:40 in the morning. 3 of her children were at her bedside, and the 4th was on FaceTime. She never received parole. She never expressed remorse in the format that the board required. She never changed her account of what happened or why. She died with her version of events intact, which, depending on how you read her, is either the last act of a woman who had nothing left to lose by honesty, or evidence that she never fully arrived at what most people mean when they talk about understanding what you've done. Dan Broderick was 44 years old when he died. He had built something genuinely impressive. He had also, in the years before his death, done things to another person that the legal system he mastered didn't have language to address. Both of those things are permanently true. Linda was 28 years old. She was 2 months pregnant. She is the person in this story who receives the least attention and who had the least power over any of what happened to her. And that's worth just remembering for a moment. The argument about Betty Broderick will continue. People will keep disagreeing about what she was and what she deserved, and whether the parole board was right, and whether the jury was right, and whether the divorce settlement was just, and whether any of that context matters when 2 people are shot dead in their bed. Those are real disagreements that don't have clean answers. Betty Broderick died in a medical facility outside a prison in San Bernardino County at 3:40 in the morning. She never said she was sorry. She never changed her story either. And that's the story of Betty Broderick. I have a lot more that I could say here, but I would just start rambling, so I'm gonna leave it where it should be left, which is that it's just a very sad story, and take it as a scareful story of the way divorces should not go. Until next time, guys, stay safe, stay careful, and maybe don't spend years turning your divorce into a full-time job. Thanks, guys.